Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund, plus another pledge of up to $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you have a little spare change, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. And if you give us $1 million, we'll name one of the fellowships after you. You can talk to me after the event to discuss this fabulous opportunity. Please note that our next event will be on Wednesday, April 23rd at 6:30 upstairs, when Jeff Kisseloff will discuss his new biography of Alger Hiss, I think 25 years in the making. He'll be in conversation with Eric Alterman. Please mark your calendars. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that you can be notified of our future events. But tonight I am delighted to welcome two extraordinary writers, Susan Morrison and Maureen Dowd, to discuss their respective books. In a change of format, we are having these two authors interrogate each other, delving into the power of satire and celebrity in our current political culture. Susan Morrison, a longtime editor at The New Yorker, is the author of Lorne, a biography of Lorne Michaels, the creator of Saturday Night Live. I'm very proud to note that Morrison worked on this biography while she was a fellow here at the Leon Levy Center. Maureen Dowd, a veteran columnist at the New York Times, is the author most recently of Notorious, Portraits of Stars from Hollywood, Culture, Fashion, and Tech. She won the 1999 Pulitzer Prize in the commentary category for, quote, her unsparing columns on the hypocrisies involved in the Lewinsky affair and the effort to impeach President Clinton. Remember that? For me, it makes me pine for the simple old-fashioned sex scandal these days. Susan and Maureen will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from our in-person audience. But we are asking that you write your queries in block letters on the note cards being passed around, and we will try to get as many of them as we can. Finally, the authors will be signing books afterwards in the lobby. So the block letter, the cards will be passed around about 7:10, and you'll have a few minutes to write your queries. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. I now turn the conversation over to Susan and Maureen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Are these on? I guess they're on.
Can you hear us?
We hadn't quite figured out how we're going to do this kind of meta thing, but just bear with us. And when I was reading Maureen's book, I was interested to see that if you do a Venn diagram of our two books, there's a lot of overlap. 10 of her subjects figure prominently in the life of Lorne Michaels. But another thing they have in common is that a lot of your subjects, like Lorne himself, are survivors. You know, they've gone the long haul. And is that one of the things that attracted you to them? And what are your thoughts about survivors?
Yeah, when I was 13, my older brother took me to see Hamlet in the park in DC, and I immediately decided Hamlet was my boyfriend. not realizing he's the worst boyfriend in literary history. And I was immediately fascinated by Hamlet's magnetism and how he used power, or in the case of Hamlet, kind of, failed to act, and why wasn't he acting? And I got really fascinated with people who kind of burn through the screen in movies or politics or later Silicon Valley. And when they get to their peak, how are they, in Shakespeare's world, often you become your own worst enemy. And I've seen that happen again and again with presidents who have just been elected. I'm watching it now, where they become their own worst enemy. And I got fascinated with that syndrome. So a lot of the people I interview are kind of, at the peak of power, and are they using their power for good or evil or mishandling it? Or, like Luke Skywalker, using the Force well. So that's what that was.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things that attracted me, that made me decide to write about Lorne, I started thinking about this book about 10 years ago after the 40th anniversary of SNL, and I realized how many generations of people, of Americans, he had, sort of determined what we think is funny, what makes us laugh, and that staying power seems so unusual. In your book, you quote Patti Smith referring to Joe Biden as, was it like the petrified forest or something like that? I mean, the idea that you could stay in this game all these years and stay alert, to what's new and fresh. And I decided that I wanted to kind of explore that. And I guess the answer is that one of the things is that he's built this incredibly sturdy formula, that transcends fashion in the generations. I mean, he often compares the show to a Snickers bar. He'll say it's, you're going to get a certain amount of chocolate, a certain amount of peanuts, a certain amount of nougat. And whether it's, Sabrina Carpenter or Paul Simon singing the songs, that the format is going to stay. But I'm interested in what you were saying about, people at their peak of power and how they use it. Most of the people that you wrote about, it seems to me, that you admire, right? And they seem to be using their power for good, I suppose, as opposed to the political beat. Did some surprise you by?
Well, that's why, at one point an editor asked me, I really wanted to write longer than 800 words, and an editor asked me if I gave up one of the columns a week, I could write for other sections, longer pieces. And I really wanted to do that because, as you know, in Washington, we've had this cascade of impeachments and wars and bad behavior and stupid behavior, and it gets wearing to always be criticizing, but what could I do? So I tried to pick people, and some of the profiles go way back before I was at the Times, and they're for Vanity Fair or GQ, or because I always thought of Washington and Hollywood as sort of mirrors of each other, where they're both about illusion, and Hollywood is about box office, and Washington is about approval ratings. And then I blended in Silicon Valley, which is about clicks, and they're all about winning and losing, and they have a lot of charismatic people. But let me ask Susan something, because I did do one of these pieces. It's not in the book because I just did it recently on Lorne. And part of it is because of my column and how tough it can be sometimes. People don't want to talk to me, believe it or not. And it's really hard to get these interviews. It took me 20 years to get Iger, and I think it took 20 years to get Lorne. I mean, I've been trying to get an interview with Lorne the whole time you were writing this amazing book. And so lots of times, Tom Ford, I think, was 5 years. And so they think it's going to be the same thing, but this is actually a much warmer forum because I want it to be like a little impressionist oil painting, like this is what it's like to spend 2 hours with Al Pacino or 5 hours with George Clooney or a week with Paul Newman. But when I was working on Lorne, I read Susan's book, and I had heard about it for a long time, but I was completely blown away. I mean, my favorite kind of book is like Keith Richards' Biography, where the person takes you into a world you would never have access to, like the Rolling Stones dressing room. And that's what this is. I mean, she takes you right backstage to SNL, starting with that crazy original cast, which is fascinating, when they had drug dealers with briefcases roaming the halls, and you know, some of them were freebasing, or one of them, right before a show. And it's just hard to believe, but it is so incredibly vivid and well reported. And I'm just curious how you got the idea and how you got the access. I mean, it's you just feel like you're actually walking the halls of SNL.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, as I said, I started thinking about it 40 years ago. I realized, you know, I worked for Lorne really briefly in 1983 during his one spectacular public failure, a show called The New Show. So I was a kid. I was 23. We vaguely knew each other. But I stayed friends with a lot of the writers who would, you know, wrote for him for years after that. And so I spent decades hearing people kind of bitch and moan about him, you know, about how, I mean, yes, he was brilliant and everybody, but mercurial and had favorites and was difficult. And I knew how obsessed his staff was with him, that they spent every waking moment when they weren't at work analyzing him, trying to figure him out. And so when I thought 10 years ago, you know, that his legacy was worth examining, I realized he'd been kind of hiding in plain sight. You know, he never talked to the press. To a handful of people in the comedy business, he was this strange Wizard of Oz, Obi-Wan Kenobi figure, but no one really knew much. So I think if I had called him up or, you know, done what you did and just said, hey, Lorne, I'd like to write about you, he would have said no. What I did, and I wasn't even intentionally that strategic about it, but so I sold the book first. I wrote a proposal. I had a lot of ideas about Lorne and the show, a lot of takes, and publishers were quite keen on it. So after I signed the deal, I went to see him in his office, and I said, Lorne, I've just sold a book about you and the show. I don't need anything from you, but if you would like to talk to me and give me access, it'll be a richer and better book. And as anyone who's read the book knows, Lorne hates nothing more than surprises. He always likes to be briefed. So he looked like he was going to have a coronary. You know, that was a moment. He sat down and ate some popcorn, and we chatted for a little while. But I think the fact that I said, I don't need anything from you, that sort of rang his bell. He hates people needing him and needing things from him. You know, if you don't need him, he respects you.
Boy, is he in the wrong job.
Exactly.
But my favorite thing is when well, first of all, Susan has a hilarious list of comparisons that friends and cast members make. So Chris Rock calls Lorne the Godfather. Bernie Brillstein calls him Jay Gatsby, because he was originally Lorne Lipowitz, coming up from the Canadian provinces to become the toast of New York society. Tracy Morgan calls him Obi-Wan Kenobi. Kate McKinnon calls him the great and powerful Oz. Jason Sudeikis calls him Citizen Kane. Victoria Jackson, obviously not a fan, called him a cult leader. Bill Hader calls him Tom Ripley. Bob Odenkirk said Lorne was a very distant, strange comedy god. And is Lorne into all this hero and devil worship where they're talking to their shrinks about him and obsessing about him at dinner? I mean, does he secretly like that?
I think he loves it. I mean,
Not secretly.
I mean, he has mind control over his staff in a way that I mean, when I was writing this book, there were times when I thought I could be writing this for the Harvard Business School as a management manual, But it's completely intuitive, I don't think he studied Machiavelli or anything, but he has this intuitive sense of how to get what he needs out of people. With some of them, it's withholding and remote and cool and cruel, and with some of them, it's much more nurturing. He, as Chris Rock said, this guy has been thousands of people's boss. He knows how to push the levers, how to get what he needs. But no, I think that he is the alpha in all of his people's lives, and I think he does like that. Some people, a few people told me that their shrinks, because they all talk to their shrinks about him, have said that he reminds them, in some respects, of Trump. A kind of a ratings-obsessed guy, mercurial, has favorites, can be fickle, sometimes is withholding. I mean, this isn't to say this is, I have a lot of respect and admiration for Lorne, but this is part of the mystique, is this strange hold his personality has on people. But that's what made it so interesting. And as I talked to him about 50 times over the years, but I also talked to all of his people, and what was unusual was how often somebody would sit down. I mean, Odenkirk is a good example, and they'd say at the beginning, I don't know if I really have a lot of good Lorne anecdotes. And then cut to 3 hours later, they'd be sobbing, crying. And I think it's the thing of, he got all these people when they were like 21 and 22, and he opened the whole world to them. So they owe everything to him,
Well, to show you what a great reporter Susan is, when I did my Lorne piece, I called the Saturday Night Live alums and current people who I had a good relationship with. I had just done a piece on Scarlett Johansson, so I called Colin Jost. He didn't call me back. I'd done a Vanity Fair profile of Tina Fey that's in the book. I called her, didn't call back. I emailed Larry David. Could I just talk to him about Lorne? Even though he wasn't there under Lorne, but he did work at Saturday Night Live, and he said, I just don't think I have anything to contribute. And I think there was even one more. I forget. Oh, Seth Meyers. I gave him my column once when there was a writer's strike, and he did it. No, wouldn't call back. So talking about Lorne is obviously a very treacherous thing, even among his very favorites.
I guess I squeezed them dry. But no, one of the things, as you know, you were just talking about how one of the
That's
reasons,
what Alec Baldwin said. I know Alec Baldwin. And I called and asked him, and he goes, I am Lorned out.
Yeah, maybe it was because I made them cry. But, no, you said earlier that one of the reasons that you wanted to break out of doing your 800-word opinion columns and start writing more of these kinds of profiles is, not just the you get to write greater length and it's a different format, but just hearing, listening to people, listening to the way people talk and getting to portray their personalities and their voices. And one of the fun things, Lorne, of course, is a great talker. He once bragged that a doctor told him he had, 45% more lung capacity than the average human. He's a big talker. But all the people that he hires are not just smart and articulate, but they're funny. They're good talkers too. But so I'm wondering, when you when you decide on a new celebrity, a new actor or actress or scary Silicon Valley person to interview, do you kind of try to suss out beforehand, can they talk? Because some people, as you know, can't talk.
Yeah, right. No, I did a column. Well, I'm still doing it, but I did 2 times a week for so long, and when you're doing a column, Tom Friedman and Anna Quinlan were friends of mine, and they said, you can't quote anyone else in the column. You can't have any other voices. It just has to be your voice, because it's 800 words, and not even that sometimes. And so I really love hearing other people's voices. I mean, I would try to bring quotes into the column, but it's hard. You have 2 quotes, and that's the whole column. So really, I did want to listen instead of, with a column, you're kind of instructing or lecturing. And I wanted to hear what other people had to say. I was so happy to hear other people talking instead of me talking that I didn't really check to see if they're great talkers. I mean, a lot of actors are not. You know, Al Pacino was very inarticulate. Kevin Costner was. You know, that isn't how their creativity works always, but it's still fascinating to see people at the peak of power.
And I mean, one of the things that I did in my book to try to make it different from, I realized as I started writing that in a biography, if you're not careful, it can just be like a death march through the years, So my book is structured so that you have it every day in the week of the show, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, careening on to Saturday, interspersed between the life chapters. And one of the things that also must have been fun for you, I mean, I was saying, in those days of the week chapters, I got to sort of draw on my, magazine editor background and set a scene and describe what people look like, and, you're there in the room. And your book is so full of these wonderful vignettes where, like, there's a great profile of Tom Ford, that the designer, that opens with him actually rearranging all the furniture in the room where the interview is going to take place. And so just to have all that at your disposal, not just writing out of your own head, but what they look like, that must have been also fun.
Yeah, the Tom Ford interview is one of my favorites because, one thing I loved about Lorne was if I ever asked him about any of these guys that he knew or women, and if I was working on a profile, I would say, just give me the one word that describes them. And Lorne was really good at coming up with one word. So when I was doing Tina Fey, I said, what is the word? And he said, it's German. And then, it turns out her father was German. Her favorite writer is Leni Riefenstahl. Colin Quinn nicknamed her Herman the German when they were on the stand-up circuit. And she's very, trains are going to run on time, Tina.
She has an amazing work ethic compared to the average comedy writer. The average comedy writer, and I discovered this in my short time working for Lorne in the 80s, is just kind of like a big baby wearing sweat clothes, can't really tie their own shoes, eating quarter pounders in the middle of the night. It's like a big playpen. And someone like Tina, who's like a kind of a clipboard personality, as well as a brilliant comedy writer, I think that one of the things that she did when she was head writer is to manage those people effectively.
Yeah, she almost broke up with her husband, when they got engaged because his friends took him out to a strip club, and Tina was not having any of that. That was not going to go down with her. But to finish what I was going to say about Tina, so the German thing unlocked Tina for me. And I would say with someone like Tom Ford, if you asked me one word, I would say trapped. Because although he himself is gorgeous and he has a gorgeous life and every object around him is gorgeous, it's kind of like the red shoes. He has such a finely tuned aesthetic sensibility that when he looks around, everything could be more beautiful. So it's already beautiful, but he can see how it could be more beautiful. So when I interviewed him in LA at the San Vicente Bungalows, You never know with fashion savants whether you should wear something of theirs as a, to impress them, or whether that's sucking up. So with Tom Ford, I splurged and got this red chiffon Tom Ford dress. And as Susan said, when I got there, he was rearranging the furniture in the hotel room, because everything can be more beautiful. So we had dinner and did the interview, and I was flying back to Washington the next day, and I opened page 6, and I see Priyanka Chopra, the actress, in the same Tom Ford red dress, but the belt is turned all the way around. And I realized I'd had on the belt backwards for the whole interview, like I had the hardware in front and the laces in back.
I'm sure you thought you were creative.
No, I called him and I said, Mr. Ford, did you notice that I had on my belt backwards? And there was this long, pained pause. And he goes, yes. It was horrible. But in a way, he is trapped, because he told me he once tried to use color on his walls, and it had to go after 3 days. He couldn't take it. Like, he is just trapped in beauty, in a way, in this beautiful aesthetic. But that Lorne one-word thing really helps.
No, he's very articulate. He's a very quick study. A lot of people say that he can know someone for just like a couple of minutes and already have them figured out. But that German, him saying German, strikes me in an interesting way, because one of the things that he would come back to in our conversations, a thing I learned that surprised me, that's an interesting part of the book, is he almost didn't take the SNL job because he didn't want to leave LA. He lived in LA, didn't want to come to New York in 1974 for the obvious reasons. You've seen Taxi Driver. But he liked the way, he said that he in California, coming from Canada, he liked the way California kind of invented the idea of fun as a value not to be ashamed of, that you could, like Elvis Presley, like watch an Elvis Presley movie and read Chekhov, and, that sort of made sense. But something I heard him say several different times is, you don't think of the Germans as saying, let's do that, it'll be fun. So it's kind of interesting that was his Tina word.
Yeah, I'm curious, because you are so inside, if you have any insight into, we all watched the Saturday Night Live anniversary show, and why didn't Dan Aykroyd and Bill Hader show up?
I haven't probed that. Aykroyd, I think, was having some kind of familial, personal thing back in Canada. I don't think there was a beef. Hader, I think I heard, was afraid that he was going to have a panic attack, even through all his years at the show. And when he guest hosts, he gets this enormous panicky stage fright, even after doing it for years.
Well, you described one time when that happened,
Yeah.
and then Lorne came up to him.
Barks at him, yeah.
Yeah, and said, get it together.
Yeah.
This is the part of Susan's book that fascinates me, because Lorne is described in the promotional materials, or the beginning of the book, as a withholding daddy. And certainly all the cast members see him as a daddy, and to a certain point, he will go along with that. But then at a certain point, he doesn't want to be responsible for everything they do. And I don't know if he was always like that, or if going through the tragedies of Belushi and Chris Farley made him like that, where he realized he had to distance himself.
Well, I think it's a heavy burden to know that all these people feel that they owe everything to you, and in the first 5 years, when there was an awful lot of drugs at the show, and his advice for people was basically just rotate your drugs. What you do on your own time is your own business. But then after Belushi's death, I think he realized that my morality about that was all wrong. I should have done more. And so by the time Chris Farley was on the show, Lorne was being really strict with him, would send him to these military rehabs in Arkansas, you know. I mean, he also likes to say that, yes, of course, Farley overdosed and died, but that nobody's actually ever died while doing the show.
Yeah,
you know, they
that's
die a few years later when they're
good
outside the
line,
discipline of
yeah.
the show. But yeah, I mean, I think he has a handful of friends, you know, Paul McCartney, Paul Simon, Steve Martin, who have a special relationship because they don't owe him everything. You know, that just must feel different. But let's to get off Lorne for a second.
Oh, wait, I do want to
okay.
ask one more Lorne question, because he's not ready to give up
Endlessly
the reins
interesting.
yet, even though he's, what, 80 now, right?
80.
But do you think Tina Fey is his natural heir, or they've mentioned Colin Jost, Seth Meyers, and Tina Fey?
I think that Tina would be fantastic at it. I don't think she'd want to do it. I don't think, you know, Lorne has never missed a Saturday night in all of the years that he's done it. He's never been home with a stomach flu. You know, I don't know if he's had B12 shots or what, but he's always there. I think, and not that Lorne isn't good at work-life balance. I mean, I think he kind of invented the term, but Tina, I don't know that she'd be ready to give everything over to the show. I think she's a little bit more, you know, just wants a more evened out life. I could see Seth and his producer Mike Shoemaker doing it, but my theory is that no single person is going to parachute in and replace Lorne. I think he's going to be doing it in some fashion for as long as he's breathing. And I think
Yeah,
that
I asked him if he wanted the show to go with him, like in ancient times when the wives would have to be burned with the husbands. But he just looked at me with that droll look and said, I'm not that bad. You know?
I think what could and should happen is, you know, there are really 2 days a week when he is completely essential, and that's Wednesday afternoon at Read Through. They listen to 4 hours worth of comedy sketches and then whittle them down to like 12 that they're going to pursue. And then Saturday at the dress rehearsal, which is also baggy and extra long, and he sits there with his laser focus and makes a million switches and cuts and changes, and that's what determined goes on the air. I mean, I think they could wheel him in for a couple of hours, 2 days a week, and that would be the Lorne, you know, the Lorne taste, and his incredibly able team of deputies. And one of the fun things in writing this book was bringing credit to these, you know, Aaron Doyle and Eric Kenward and Steve Higgins and Carolyn Maroney, these people who really do so much work day to day.
But, you know, what's interesting about this is when Lorne started, what was it, VCR? And now it's TikTok. And I notice a big difference in the sense of humor, you know, of Gen X and millennials versus boomers. And it's interesting that the same man can be the most influential man in comedy, even though humor, you know, humor is a very topical thing. It changes generation to generation.
Well, one of the most interesting parts of the research for me was the 10 years when Lorne was bouncing around Hollywood before SNL, and he worked on a lot of really lame variety shows that were, you know, the Perry Como Christmas special.
I love that.
Yeah, no, me too. I mean, and he arrived in Hollywood with long hair and a hippie headband, you know, ready to change the culture. But most of variety television was kind of like stuck in the 50s, if not earlier, if not like radio and vaudeville. And he became a real student of knowing when the music changed. And I think in Hollywood in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a particularly interesting time of cultural collision. You know, you had like Dean Martin having the Stones on his show, you know, and not liking it, you know, not liking those long-haired guys on his show. And so Lorne, you know, he doesn't like social discomfort. I think he clocked a lot of that and just somehow figured out, you know, he never wanted to be that old guy, you know, the grandmother with a hula hoop, as I call it, you know. And so he's always paid attention to those shifts, and he's very smart about hiring young, cool people who he's happy to delegate to, and also to listen to his own teenage and now 20-something-year-old children.
Oh, well, wait, before we get off this topic of Lorne, we have to discuss Lorne and Trump.
Yes.
So I was at the show in 2015 when Trump was the host, and the after party, and it had a very uncomfortable vibe because Killiam had
Taron
Killiam had said this was outrageous to allow Trump to be the host of the show when he was going to run for president. And some of the cast members came up to Lorne's table to greet Trump very gingerly. Others stayed away. Others were really mad. But can you talk for a minute about Lorne's philosophy about politics and, these incidents? And Elon was on the show once, and that caused some controversy.
Well, from the beginning, he'd be the first to say that it was Watergate that inspired him to want to do this kind of show, because nobody was talking about politics on television. But when he started the show, he wanted always just to speak truth to power. They made fun of Jimmy Carter, they made fun of Gerald Ford, it was sort of whoever was in office. And that has pretty much been his policy all the way through. There's, a lot of hilarious sketches about Bill Clinton, when Clinton was in office. That's become a little harder now because our political situation is such a terrifying disaster, but also because of the sort of, he would probably say snowflakey sensibilities of the young people who work for him, who really think that they should just be social justice warriors every week. And, Lorne's idea is, it's comedy. First of all, you want to go where the laughs are. When I was there one week, Cecily Strong didn't want to impersonate Dianne Feinstein, and because they had her as a kind of drawling, doddering old lady. It was funny. She was a drawling, doddering old lady. And Lorne would say, well, we're not partisan. We're not going to not have Democrats in our sights. So that's always been his line. But it's true, in the age of Trump, when the stakes seem so high, it's harder for him. Well,
when I interviewed Kate McKinnon for my Lorne piece recently, she said at some point she had to kind of withdraw from the political sketches because she respected Lorne, but she thought it was too important, to...
Yeah, they have kind of a conundrum now. To go back to what you were saying about Taron Killam, he was impersonating Trump. And Lorne has a note he gives everybody when they're doing an impersonation, whether it's an impersonation of a politician or, an actor, that no matter how awful the person is, you have to give them a little drop of humanity, maybe some oily charm. It's like Richard III or like Alan Rickman in Die Hard, something that's going to engage the audience,
Well, the guy who does Trump now has a very different Trump than Alec Baldwin's, I think.
Yeah, Alec Baldwin's was more deranged and scary.
Yeah, because the guy now, he captures something very real about Trump, but it makes it more sympathetic because he captures like the humor that tends to counter the authoritarianism for Trump's fans.
Right. No, he sort of, he lays bare what it is that makes Trump appealing to those people, which, is uncomfortable. But I think the bigger problem that they have right now is that, some of the old timers, some of the writers from the 90s and later will say, that James Austin Johnson who does Trump, sometimes it almost looks like they're doing kind of beat for beat Trump, like what he did that week. And that's just because, are you guys familiar with the TV term jumping the shark? The reality is just so crazy, much crazier than anything a comedy writer could have ever come up with, that it's almost parody proof. And sometimes it's hard to, it's not even funny anymore. My Pillow guy used to be a punchline, but now that guy has a seat in the White House press room, right?
I was just going to say that. This is so funny. My assistant is working on a story about the new White House reporters, and one of them is the My Pillow guy's White House reporter, and that tells you everything you need to know. And the other one is Steve Bannon's White House reporter. So they're replacing the Times and CNN in the front row at the briefing room. But when, when I was doing this Tina Fey piece, she was doing her incomparable imitation of Sarah Palin. And I remember Seth Meyers was writing it, and it was almost word for word Palin. I mean,
Yeah.
they ratcheted up a little bit, but they didn't need to do much.
Right. Well, to the point, the oily charm thing that I was just saying, so you covered the White House, and covered the White House for such a long time. I wanted to ask your opinion of something that came up a lot. I know Will Ferrell has had misgivings over the years that the way he played George W. Bush, as such a kind of good time guy that, you wanted to have a beer with, that he has apprehensions that he unwittingly helped put him in the White House. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I've talked to Lorne about this a lot, and Will Ferrell definitely, thought that happened, and it might have happened. Because I remember when he started that imitation of W, he was like, he was treating him as very vacant, I would say. And I remember he was playing with a rubber band ball, like a cat. But then as it went along, he got some of it bled into the character. He got some of Will Ferrell's charm, and humor, and it got to be a much more appealing character. And I do think that could have helped. And that was why when I covered Tina during this period, she was doing Palin. I mean, I think, wasn't her father a Republican? It wasn't even that she was so anti-Republican. I remember her having to get tickets for, I think, her husband's parents for a Palin rally. But it was like she didn't like the idea of affecting the race one way or the other. It wasn't, she just didn't like it. So when Palin came on the show, she did not want to be in a skit with her where they were together on stage. I mean, she claimed it was too sweaty, that it was too obvious, but I don't know. I think she was sort of fearful, like Will Ferrell, that too much, chumming it up with Sarah Palin would give a halo to Sarah Palin. So they walked past each other in the same outfit, but she wouldn't do a thing with her.
Yeah, there's a term at the show. I mean, sometimes I think I should put a glossary of SNL terms in the paperback edition because it's such a funny language all its own. They have this term called a sneaker upper, and that's when somebody who does an impression of somebody ends up on stage with the actual person, and it's like, hoo, 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 hoo. And so, yeah, I think Tina thought that it would be too much complicity, Yeah. And she, to this day, I think, is afraid that this will be the first line of her obituary, and who would want that, right? Yeah. But I want to just jump.
It was very surreal. I mean, I have to say, you would know better, but Lorne, I think even Lorne was sort of dumbstruck the whole time, because to have John McCain come and do a skit with Tina as Sarah Palin, what were they selling, Ginsu knives or something? But that was an amazing thing. And Tina and Lorne seemed a little shocked by the way the whole thing snowballed.
No, I think when these things happen, Lorne, I mean, it's, he's weathered so many years of Saturday Night Dead headlines. The show, it's up or it's down. People, he says it's just like the Yankees or the Dow. You have to just wait it out. But there have been so many of these political moments when
Yeah, he says uneven is going to be on his tombstone. Yeah. But why is the show uneven? Is that a natural thing in comedy, or some years, are they not trying hard enough to get the right writers
Well,
and cast members?
He'll say that it takes 3 years, to have a kind of changing of the guard of cast or writers, for all the kinks to be wrinkled out. And, generally in this day and age, the network would not have the patience to wait for 3 years and somebody would be yanked off the air. But, he's always just seen it as a really long game. And there definitely are times when the show's weaker. There have been other issues, like in the mid-'90s when Lorne was almost fired from the show because the executives, they were baby boomers. They missed Bill Murray as the lounge singer. They didn't like Adam Sandler. They thought he was a weirdo.
Yeah, tell this story about Adam Sandler and Norm Macdonald getting fired, because that's very telling about Lorne.
Yeah, no, it gives you his sense of what some of his people call his Fabius Maximus strategy.
And isn't Adam Sandler kind of the most famous?
Yeah.
He did better than...
Yeah, probably made more money at the box office than any SNL alum. But anyway, in the mid-'90s, the way Lorne tells it, it was the first time in the show's life that the critics and the network were on the same side in terms of hating the show. And that had to do with the fact that, the show began by and for baby boomers. And, the guys, Don Ohlmeyer and these other executives in LA, they missed the old cast. They didn't like, these young, laddish, sillier performers like Chris Farley and David Spade and Adam Sandler. And the critics were also that same age, and they didn't like them either. Jim Walcott in The Voice eviscerated the show that year. It was kind of interesting. And so at the same time, NBC was having a big success with Seinfeld and Friends. So they just decided they knew comedy. And they basically forced Lorne to fire those guys. And, another person might have kicked up a big fuss or threatened to quit, but he's, as Conan O'Brien says, if in the game of thrones of show business, Lorne will be the last one standing. He's outlived all these different administrations. He knew that being a martyr wasn't really going to help. He would maybe...
Yeah, he says in your book, don't be a martyr. Judaism doesn't celebrate that.
Yeah.
But also, he doesn't like confrontation. He also claims he was exhausted because he had just been to Chris Farley's funeral and maybe he should have stood up more. But when you look back at it now, it's kind of like, wow, you couldn't save Adam Sandler.
Well, and then the other thing that happened, though, is a year later, after Sandler had some huge box office hit with Billy Madison or something, that same executive who had fired him called Lorne and said, can you get me a print of that movie for my kid's birthday party? I was wrong about him.
That's Hollywood,
So, in those early years in Hollywood, Lorne had seen the Smothers Brothers, whom he had admired hugely, get yanked off the air because they went to the brink. They wouldn't stop doing the Vietnam stuff. And yes, that's honorable in a certain way, but, Lorne's been on the air for 50 years. And as he'll be the first one to say, you just have to stay on the air.
But then what happened with Conan O'Brien and Lorne?
Well, that's a very interesting, complicated story. I'm just wondering if people want to hear it.
Did Lorne think he was going to be a producer?
When Lorne plucked Conan from obscurity, from the ranks of writers, to be David Letterman's replacement at late night, and really was a kingmaker in Conan's case. Not that Conan isn't enormously talented, but then when Conan moved to The Tonight Show, which was in LA, there was a widespread expectation that Lorne would be the executive producer of that show. That didn't happen for reasons that are still a little bit murky, but my take is that the NBC executive said to Conan and his producer, you don't need him, you're here now. And but so then when Conan hit some rough spots and NBC, was sort of pulling Jay Leno back into going head-to-head with him, Lorne wasn't really there to protect him. And the feeling is
Conan sounds,
that there was a slight.
Conan sounds very wistful in the book. But also, wait, I had one more Trump question. So what does having Trump as president with this totally different, vulgar, hyper macho tone he brings, give Saturday Night Live some cover to be less PC? So he's might not be liked, but is he sort of helping them? Because some of the jokes seem a little less PC. Like when they did the anniversary special, they couldn't put in any of the un-PC stuff, like what News for the Hard of Hearing. And they didn't put in Belushi Samurai, right?
Well,
'Cause
at the
that's cultural
40th anniversary, they
appropriation.
didn't do any of those things that,
No.
that you couldn't do anymore. And then for the 50th, they did something that I mean, I was kind of surprised they did it, but I was pleased because I like those old offensive jokes. Here's a whole clip package of things we couldn't do anymore. And it was all sorts of, all of those kinds of things, ethnic jokes. But I don't know that, I mean, no one thinks it through that much there. I don't think they felt that they had cover to be on PC. And what I'm more interested about is how in Trump's first administration, if you remember, he was constantly tweeting about Lorne and the show and trying to say that there should be federal probes, it should be taken off the air. And some of the young writers told me, like, I'm afraid that sometimes I get scared that just one of my dumb comedy sketches is going to make him blow up the world. He seems more obsessed with SNL than with ISIS. This time, he's not really paying attention to it.
Well, he did tweet, he shifted his attention to George Clooney. So he tweeted the other day that George Clooney was a third-rate actor and this and that about George Clooney. And I had just interviewed George Clooney. So I said, I texted him and I said, well, just remember, when you were making Ocean's 11, Donald Trump was applying to play the president in Sharknado 3. Believe it or not, only a few months before he ran for the real presidency. That's my favorite,
I didn't know that.
footnote about Trump. Yeah, he wanted to be the president.
Are there audition tapes?
And he didn't get to be the president of Sharknado 3, but we made him the real president.
Well, I think one of the reasons that it's tricky to do Trump comedy now, if you think about it, I mean, even more than Reagan, I mean, he basically got into the White House because of show business, right? I mean, it was all The Apprentice. And that's why he was probably an effective host those two times he hosted.
Yeah, they're replaying it on Amazon or something, right? But there's a big debate now in the Democratic Party. It's like they think Beyonce didn't help Kamala and maybe, celebrities should just stay out of it because it makes Democrats seem more elitist. Or do they need to fight fire with fire? Trump's P.T. Barnum, do they need their own showmen? So, yeah, they're talking about
Well, we
that.
certainly don't have one on our side, do we?
No.
But now, Kai is signaling to me that we have a couple minutes, but I want to want you one final, one non-Lorne related question. One of my favorite pieces in your wonderful book is about Cindy Adams, who's a great New Yorker. And in it, she talks about how, about how there's been sort of a devolution in the celebrity world. You once had Judy Garland, and now you have Meghan Markle. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I
it's
think in
true?
the old days, Cindy Adams is such a character. And, I went to her 94th birthday party last year. And her motto is, if you're indicted, you're invited. And her guest list matched it. There was let me think, Governor Cuomo was there with his mother, and Eric Adams.
Rudy?
Eric Adams was at the bar, and Bill O'Reilly, and Woody Allen. And she is just an incredible character. I really loved her. And, what she was complaining about was in the old days, you could just call up a movie star. or someone famous and talk to them. But now more and more, if she wants to call J-Lo, she has to go through 20 people, and then she never gets her anyway. So, but she is really funny. She has a really interesting relationship with Donald Trump, where they were very good friends through the years, and he helped her. He took her up in a helicopter to scatter her husband's ashes. Her husband was a comedian. And she really liked him, but she also kind of wanted to distance herself because she was kind of scared of what being close to him would result in during the first term. But I think they're still kind of tight.
She also said
She really likes dictators. She used to hang out with Imelda Marcos.
she wrote.
and Sukarno,
I have a book that she wrote called Sukarno and Me.
Yeah, that's it. Sukarno, she would hang out with. So she has no problem with dictators.
So we're on to the question part.
We're on to the Q&A session. It sounds to me, Maureen, like maybe you are about to embark on a biography of Cindy Adams.
I would read it.
Yeah, she's wild.
So we have a number of questions here, maybe more than we can get to, but we'll try. So, Maureen, what was your most difficult interview and why?
Well, I have one in the book with Kevin Costner from a long time ago when he was Hollywood's head hunk. And I'll apologize in advance to Yellowstone viewers because that was a case where, as Susan said, I pick people whose talent, or leadership skills or something I admire or am fascinated by, and I thought Kevin Costner was great. And then I went down to New Orleans to interview him when he was making JFK, and there was a lot of controversy swirling around that movie. And he had just made Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, and there was a lot of criticism that his English accent was now you see it, now you don't. So again, it's what I'm describing to you that I like, to see someone at the height of their power who then either is able to proceed with grace or becomes their own worst enemy. So he was very surly, and we were walking down a street in New Orleans to get to the hotel where the interview was, and there were these two fantastic senior women at the red light who very, very gingerly approached him and said, "Would you mind if we took a picture of you while the light's red?" And he just lost it and started yelling at them, "How dare you? Can't you see I'm in an interview?" And the interview hadn't even started yet. We weren't doing it at a red light. And it was like watching someone kick kittens. I know he was having a bad day, but then in the interview, the whole interview was about why was I getting the interview and what was the New York Times and why was I getting an interview by myself. And so by the end of it, my crush on Kevin Costner had totally evaporated. And as I left, he squeezed the back of my neck and he goes, "Don't worry, everybody has a bad day now and then." And I'm like, "You're the one having the bad day. What is this?" But then he goes, "Are you going to play this tape for your girlfriends?" And I said, "Look, I interviewed Paul Newman, and I managed not to play that tape for my girlfriends, so I'm certainly not playing this for them." But just briefly, one of the hardest interviews I did was Denzel Washington, because I admire him as an actor so much. He can do Shakespeare brilliantly. I just love that movie Training Day with Ethan Hawke, and but he's extremely guarded, and so he'll challenge the premise of any question you ask. And I was just trying to ask softballs, like what was it like to film Macbeth? And he's like, "I don't remember, that was 2 years ago." But every premise would be challenged. So then I got to the part of the interview that's confirm and deny, which is just like a fun chance, like a lightning round to give the person a chance to be charming or funny or whatever. So I was explaining it to him. I go, confirm and deny, it's just silly, it's fun, it's silly. And he just gave me that training day look. And he goes, if it's silly, why are you doing it? But then we got on the subject of his favorite ice cream, and his whole face lit up. And he's like, butter pecan. And I saw that great Denzel smile.
So here's a question for each of you, for both of you. What are some of your writing rituals? How do you do it? Do you keep a journal? Do you keep a diary? Do you go to sleep at night thinking what you're going to write the next morning?
I don't keep a journal or a diary, and I'll just quickly say, I have been an editor for 40 years. This is the first thing, really, that I've ever written. You know, I'm the rare person who's published her first written effort the same month she's applied for Medicare. but I did get two tips from writers who I edit that helped me along the way. One is when things seem really hard. I think this is called the tomato method. Anyone know what that is? You set a kitchen timer. I guess they used to be shaped like tomatoes for an hour, and just make sure that you don't do anything except you're writing for that hour. You don't look at your phone or anything. And then the other thing, the writer David Owen gave me a good tip once, which is before you stop writing for the day, have somewhere in your head like a notion of what you're going to start with the next morning. But you're a real writer, so you must have real tips.
No, didn't Jonathan Franzen like rip all the power cords out of his house or something? I don't know. No, I only write through sheer fear. So I just sit there and look at a blank screen until the very last minute. And when I was sometimes doing my columns in New York, and I used to have an office there, although now it's just planks for everyone. But I would be sitting in my office, and I would actually hear, when we used to have delivery trucks before AI, I would actually hear the delivery trucks running, and I would be looking at a blank screen, and that is truly scary.
So another question. The questioner asks, I am interested to know what the first draft of your books was like. How much of the first draft ended up in the book?
Well, I think because I'm an editor, when I started, I was going really slow because I kept wanting everything to be perfect. And then one of my writers, Tad Friend, said, no, you got to do the vomit draft. You know, just put everything there, everything you have, just put it all down, and don't look back at it. So I started doing it that way, and then I ended up with a manuscript that was 300,000 words, which is, as you know, way too long. So then I had to cut it down to 200,000 words. That was really, really hard. But again, a really good exercise. I mean, it's probably why it almost broke me, but that's what I did.
Maureen?
Oh, well, mine is a collection, so it doesn't really apply. I mean,
But are your
it was
first
hard.
drafts tidy? or
Are my
long?
what?
Are your drafts?
Oh,
They might-
nothing about me is tidy. No, I have a really, once they allowed me to write more than 800 words, I started writing War and Peace level, so the cutting is very painful. And in this, the problem was deciding who you were going to leave out. And there are lots of people, I wish there would be a volume 2, because there are lots of people like Baz Luhrmann and George Clooney and Lorne. I would love you to see those pieces.
So one more question, and then I think we have to break. But so I guess this is for Susan. When you describe Lorne's experience before SNL, what might he have thought of the Laugh-In show?
Well, Lorne was a writer on the staff of Laugh-In, and it was a hit show, but he quickly realized that working at a hit show wasn't any more interesting or fun than working at a lousy show. And this ended up informing how he conceived of SNL. The problem was that in all of these shows, the writers, like at Laugh-In, the writers didn't even work in the studio. They worked in a motel, some miles away. And they just all spouted, one-liners and jokes, and they all went into the maw. And they never got to see their jokes. They never got to see the scripts. It was just like a sausage factory. And, he would say that they would watch the show on Monday night, and maybe you'd see glimmers of your jokes on the air. But there was no sense of authorship, of, creative ownership. And so that, he learned something from that. But the other thing about Laugh-In that was frustrating for him is it was a real engagement with a counterculture in a lot of ways. There were psychedelic colors and miniskirts and body paint, but politically it was kind of toothless. Lorne kept wanting to get Nixon jokes on the air, but they didn't do any political humor. The closest thing that I could find was Goldie Hawn making a joke where she confused King Kong with a Viet Cong, but that was basically it.
Well, anyway, thank you very much. This has been a lovely conversation.
Thank you. It was fun.
And thank you to the Leon Levy Foundation and Shelby White. Come to our next event, April 23rd. Thank you.